April 24, 1945, 500 hours, northern Luzon, the Philippines. The Imperial Japanese 2nd Tank Division had spent 3 weeks digging in beneath the fog-shrouded ridgelines near San Fernando. Engineers had tunneled into the hillsides. Observation posts were masked under brush. Every approach was covered by pre-sighted mortars, artillery, and concealed Type 147 anti-tank guns. The division commander, General Hisashi Tanaka, believed they had prepared a kill zone no American battalion could cross. At exactly 5:07, he felt the mountain vibrate beneath his boots. The sound was slow, heavy, not an explosion, not at first. It was more like pressure, like thunder without lightning. Trees several kilometers away began to sway. Leaves lifted from the jungle floor as if gravity had forgotten them. Then a wall of noise hit the command bunker like a bomb. The ground outside shattered in a column of fire and earth. Men screamed. Branches became spears. Radio towers collapsed in a rain of steel splinters, and none of it made sense. There had been no aircraft, no warning, no shells in the sky. Tanaka's aide stumbled into the bunker, blood running from one ear. "Sir, there were no planes." It wasn't bombing. It wasn't close-range artillery. The 155 Long Tom had just reached across 14 miles of terrain and obliterated their strongest position before anyone heard the first whistle. The Americans never saw the bunkers they hit. They didn't have to. Battery B of the 218th Field Artillery Battalion had spent the night in silent coordination with aerial reconnaissance and forward observers embedded miles ahead. Coordinates were punched into fire control tables, elevation adjusted, powder bags calibrated. The Long Tom guns, each over 40 feet long from muzzle to trail, sat positioned in jungle clearings covered with netting. They didn't look like artillery. They looked like rail guns, too big, too stable, too perfectly horizontal for jungle warfare. At 500, the order came. Fire for effect. 12 Long Toms opened up in unison. Each shell weighed 95 pounds. Each shell was longer than a man's forearm. The guns recoiled in thunderous waves, carving trenches into the jungle with every shot. Trees shed leaves in concentric rings. The first volley hit with no sound. Only when the second was already airborne did the thunder from the first reach the observers near the impact zone. By then it was already too late. Major Kazuo Miyake, an artillery specialist for the 23rd Japanese Infantry Regiment, stared at the ruins of what used to be a regimental headquarters. An entire ridge had vanished, not cratered, not shelled, gone. "Where are the shells coming from?" he asked, voice dry. No one answered. He sent scouts forward. None returned. Then he sent engineers to find the impact angle of the shells. The report returned an hour later. "They are descending at a flat trajectory, sir, almost horizontal, but the shells themselves are massive." Miyake froze. Horizontal trajectory, at that distance. No Japanese artillery had that range. He did the mental math. The distance from the known American front line to the impact site was impossible. Over 20 kilometers. That couldn't be. The Type 96 150 howitzers Japan used maxed out under 12 kilometers. Even the American 105 shouldn't be able to do this. But the Long Tom wasn't a 105. It was a 155 gun with a maximum range of 14 miles, over 22 kilometers. And now it had found them. By noon, Japanese positions across northern Luzon were under sustained fire, but the pattern confused them. Bunkers were destroyed before American infantry advanced. Pillboxes exploded seconds before their fields of fire were needed. Ammunition dumps went up in fireballs, despite being relocated days earlier. It was as if the Americans could see through the jungle. They weren't seeing through it, they were reaching past it. The Long Tom wasn't just about range. It was precision. The Americans had trained with aerial spotters, radio triangulation, and field survey teams since Tunisia. Now, with jungle observers calling in exact coordinates, the long toms were threading shells into ridgelines with pinpoint accuracy. General Tanaka issued a desperate order. Retreat to fallback line Delta, regroup for counterattack, hold until nightfall. It took 10 minutes to send the order by runner. By the time the message reached Delta Line, it was already under bombardment. The American fire table had already predicted the fallback position. The shells were already in flight. Staff Sergeant Bill Kaiser, a long Tom gun commander from Iowa, leaned on the breech of his weapon, sweat running down his back. His crew worked in rhythm, like a pit crew for a machine that only dealt in death. One man loaded powder bags. Another loaded the shell. Another adjusted elevation. Kaiser verified coordinates. Then came the moment. Fire. The gun kicked like a beast. The entire jungle floor trembled. There was no satisfaction, no cheer. Kaiser didn't see the enemy, he didn't need to. He only had to hear the distant voice of a forward observer scratch over the radio minutes later. Good effect on target, no movement left. In Tokyo, reports from Luzon arrived that week. Something was wrong. Entire divisions were being dismantled without visible enemy contact. A colonel in the Imperial General Staff asked bluntly, "Are they using naval guns from offshore?" "No, these impacts are inland. There are no ships near those valleys." Airstrikes. Negative, no aircraft reported, no bomb craters. So what is it? The silence was long. Then someone quietly unfolded a captured field manual and placed it on the table. On the page, 155 gun M1 Long Tom, max range, 25,000 yards. The colonel blinked. That's 14 miles. Yes, and they're using them as if they were mortars. At the front, Tanaka had run out of answers. Night fell. Rain soaked the ridge. His remaining officers whispered about relocation, but where would they go? They couldn't see the guns. They couldn't hear them before it was too late. They couldn't even fire back. Their own artillery couldn't reach the launch point. Their scouts couldn't survive long enough to spot it. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was one-sided annihilation. A sergeant approached, mud covering half his face. "Sir, we found a crater near the observation point. It's over 5 meters wide." Tanaka stared at him, and it's the size of a small house. Tanaka sat down in the mud and said nothing. He understood now. The Americans weren't just fighting them. They were erasing them. The rain continued for 3 days. It came in heavy bands, soaking everything, pooling in craters so deep they could hide a truck. American infantry hadn't yet crested the ridges, and already the Japanese 2nd Tank Division was dissolving under a fire it couldn't locate, much less return. On the 4th morning, General Tanaka ordered his remaining Type 97 tanks to pull back into a valley south of Kameling, hoping the jungle terrain would provide cover. His logic was sound, but the Americans didn't need to see tanks anymore. They only needed to see what they destroyed. By 1,000 hours, the forward observer hidden on a hill 10 miles away called in a new fire mission. Coordinates transmitted, line of sight established. The Long Toms fired 4 shells. Each took 40 seconds to arrive. The first struck directly on top of the lead tank, flipping it like a toy. The second penetrated a camouflaged tree line, detonating among fuel drums. The third and fourth walked down the column with mathematical precision. Within minutes, the armored retreat was reduced to columns of smoke. There had been no close combat, no ambush, no warning. Only destruction. From the air, reconnaissance planes mapped the devastation. Photographs developed aboard carriers were sent to Fire Control Headquarters near Lingian Gulf. Staff officers marveled at the blast patterns. The guns weren't just hitting general areas. They were knocking out precise targets in terrain that no direct observer could see. Colonel Ray Norris of the 524th Field Artillery Group leaned over one photograph and pointed at a grid. "That's a Japanese mess area. You see those canvas roofs?" His fire direction officer nodded. "You want to hit their chow tent?" Norris didn't smile. "No, I want them to know we can." The next morning, that exact grid was struck. 3 long tom shells. One landed 10 yards from the kitchen fire. That day, 27 Japanese soldiers didn't eat. And every man who survived swore that somehow the Americans had eyes inside the jungle. Major Miyake wrote his after-action report in a trembling hand. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. The pages were damp from rain, smudged by blood and dirt. But he wrote carefully, as if the act of documenting might delay the next barrage. Enemy long-range fire appears to originate from beyond known engagement zones. Standard counterbattery measures ineffective. Communications have collapsed. Morale degraded. Then he paused, tapped the pencil against his helmet, and added, "Perception among survivors: the enemy no longer fights fair. They reach too far." In Baguio, 40 miles to the north, Imperial officers huddled around a captured American artillery manual found near a wrecked jeep. One engineer, a Kyoto University graduate, traced the firing tables with a ruler. "It's not just the range," he said. "It's their integration." "What do you mean?" an infantry captain asked. "They coordinate with aircraft, with spotters, with radar, with maps more detailed than any we've ever produced. They're not just firing blindly." The engineer looked up, eyes hollow. "They're drawing pictures with explosives." The Japanese command ordered a counter-raid on the American gun positions. A platoon of elite troops moved south through the jungle at night, avoiding American patrols, dodging booby traps, swimming through rivers with their rifles wrapped in waxed cloth. After 2 days, they reached the edge of a jungle clearing. What they saw stopped them cold. 6 long tom guns, fully entrenched, camouflaged with netting, surrounded by sandbag walls and guarded by machine gun nests. Diesel generators buzzed. Radios crackled. Trucks full of shells idled nearby. And everywhere Americans, moving with casual confidence. The Japanese hadn't expected an entire forward base. The platoon leader called off the assault. "We'd need a battalion," he muttered, "maybe more." They melted back into the jungle. None of them fired a shot. Back on the ridges, American infantry advanced. Slowly, methodically. Their boots sank into mud that stank of cordite and death. They passed the ruins of trenches that had once bristled with defenders but now lay abandoned. Private Jack Calhoun of the 32nd Infantry Division paused at a shattered pillbox. The top was missing. The concrete had been folded in on itself like bread dough. He asked his sergeant, "Was this an airstrike?" The sergeant shook his head. "Nope, Long Tom got it yesterday." Calhoun looked up. There wasn't a crater nearby. The shell had come from so far away it had landed almost horizontal. He stared for a long time and said nothing. In Tokyo, military scientists began assembling a secret report. Codenamed Naigun, it cataloged American artillery capability across the Pacific theater. But there was a problem. The data kept changing. Shell types, ranges, mobility, fire rates, the Americans were adapting too fast. One analyst, a former mathematician, summarized it in a single line. "Every time we map the battlefield moves." On May 2, 1945, a Japanese convoy attempted to reposition through a valley south of Mount Ararat under cover of storm clouds. 20 trucks, 24 ox carts, and 100 infantry moved in silence, believing the weather would shield them. It didn't. The valley was already registered in the fire tables. Clouds didn't matter. Elevation had been calculated the day before, and the spotters on Hill 390 had radios built to punch through weather. At 9:43, the first long tom round hit the lead truck. At 9:46, the rear of the column was gone. By 9:52, nothing moved in the valley. Major Meek watched the aftermath from a ridge. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He simply folded the fire map he'd been issued 2 weeks ago and threw it into the mud. "None of this means anything anymore," he said. And no one disagreed. The shelling continued through May. Each day, new ridges fell. Each night, American fire licked the horizon with silent flashes that turned stone into dust. There were no flares, no warnings, no whistles. Only the sound of the air being crushed, and the brief moment between thunder and death. By mid-May, entire Japanese regiments in northern Luzon no longer asked where the shells were coming from. They had accepted that the origin didn't matter. What mattered was when. Because once the Americans had coordinates, the outcome was inevitable. At 7:31 hours on May 17th, the 39th Independent Mixed Brigade began digging fallback trenches east of the Agno River. They'd withdrawn without contact, hoping to regroup behind natural river defenses. The plan was to slow the American advance just long enough to prepare a final stand near Bayambang. The trench line was 300 meters long, following the tree line, concealed beneath canopies strung with bamboo. Sandbags had been hastily stacked, range markers painted, machine gun nests camouflaged under burlap. At 7:34, the Americans fired 6 ranging shells. At 7:39, the first real salvo began. The long toms opened fire from more than 20 kilometers away, elevation locked, wind adjusted. Each shell tore through jungle with a hiss louder than any scream. By 7:45, the position no longer existed. No Americans had ever seen the trench line. No drone had flown overhead. The coordinates had come from a scout team that had seen footprints near the river at dusk. That was all. That was enough. General Tanaka received the report while crouched in the basement of a collapsed radio station near Tarlac. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His division no longer functioned as a command structure. It was now a list of names being crossed out hourly. He stared at the hand-sketched map, tracing a finger across the ruined sector. "They knew we'd fall back," he said. "Not a question, a statement." Captain Hirofumi, one of the last surviving officers, spoke softly. "They didn't chase us, they anticipated us." Tanaka stood slowly. "We aren't being outflanked, we aren't being ambushed, we are being predicted." From across the valley, Private Thomas Macready adjusted the legs of his spotting scope. He couldn't see the enemy, not directly, but he saw smoke columns rise behind the ridges, thin gray tendrils signaling precise strikes. He marked the grid with grease pencil. "Looks like another ammo dump gone," he said to his radio man. "Send back B-59, same coordinates, elevation unchanged." 10 minutes later, another shell landed exactly where the last one had. "Scratch it," Macready muttered. "That's gone." The radio man asked, "You ever feel bad not seeing what we're hitting?" Macready didn't answer for a while. Then he finally said, "No, because if we do this right, we never have to meet them face to face." The battle for Luzon was no longer a series of advances. It had become a slow, brutal erasure. Entire topographical features, hills, terraces, ravines, were reshaped by sustained long-tom bombardment. Rainwater collected in fresh craters. Bamboo forests were flattened into mulch. And always the Americans advanced. Infantry followed the shellfire, sweeping through steaming ruins that had once been fortified zones. Occasionally they found survivors dazed, deafened, half-blind. Most didn't resist. Many tried to run. All were cut down before they could escape. The Japanese began abandoning trenches the moment they were dug. One captain scrawled an order in his notebook: dig only for deception. Never sleep where you prepare. But even that didn't work. The Americans had already begun to reverse the logic of camouflage. They learned where the Japanese should be based on where they weren't, and the long toms were adjusted accordingly. The forest was mapped by absence. In late May, American engineers completed the construction of a new forward fire base 12 miles inland. It had been built entirely under canvas, with supply chains running through the jungle on prefabricated tracks. Within 6 hours of completion, 4 additional long-tom batteries were brought online. The next day, they began shelling supply lines behind the remaining Japanese front. It wasn't just battlefield fire anymore. It was interdiction. The Americans weren't hunting soldiers. They were erasing logistics. Bridges collapsed. River fords exploded. Storage caves caved in. Horses bolted. Messengers never arrived. Radios fell silent. Tanaka stopped calling it artillery in his reports. He called it the voice of the horizon. Because that's what it had become. Not a weapon aimed from a point, but a pressure, a presence, a sound that came from no specific place and destroyed every specific thing. In Tokyo, the general staff began examining the Luzon losses with growing dread. No fixed artillery of the Imperial Army could counter a 155mm gun with 14-mile range. No maneuver could dodge what was already in flight. They issued a classified bulletin to all commands. Do not attempt counter-battery fire on known 155mm gun coordinates unless elevation is under 12,000 feet and within Type 96 max range. Ambush methods ineffective. Recommended action: relocation, deception, dispersion. In private, a colonel admitted, "We're not fighting artillery anymore. We're fighting God." One battalion attempted to survive by moving entirely at night and burying all traces of its presence before dawn. They were discovered after a scout noted a dry riverbed whose stones had been disturbed in a pattern not consistent with runoff. Shells were fired before the battalion had even finished breakfast. The survivors ran screaming into the jungle, many with their uniforms still half-buttoned. By early June, Japanese survivors began surrendering without engagement, not from starvation, not from encirclement, but from the silence that preceded a long tom strike. A corporal described it later in a Red Cross report. You feel it before you hear it. The air changes, your ears compress, then the ground lifts, and then you wake up covered in other men's blood. He shook his head. That's not war, that's something else. American morale surged. The infantry knew the guns were watching over them. One sergeant etched into his helmet liner, "Long Tom loves me." A running joke emerged in field kitchens. If the Japs sneeze, a 155 drops on them before they can cough. It wasn't far from the truth. By June 20th, General Tanaka's headquarters was gone. Not captured, not overrun, just gone. Forward observers hadn't even targeted it directly. The long toms had been aiming at a supply tunnel nearby. The 5th shell fell short by 300 meters and landed directly on the command dugout. Nothing remained. Captain Hirofumi, now the highest-ranking survivor, scrawled a message to Tokyo on a scrap of cloth. Our commanders have not been killed by combat. They have been erased by range. In southern Okinawa, April 1945, it began happening again. Long-range artillery was not supposed to be decisive here. The island was too narrow, the terrain too jagged, the defenders too dug in. Japanese strategists had long assumed that any landings would devolve into brutal, close-quarter fighting, caves, ridges, suicide assaults. The terrain demanded it. But 3 days into the campaign, Japanese headquarters in Shuri Castle collapsed without warning. No warning aircraft, no visual spotters, no conventional artillery in range. And yet, a shell had punched directly into the command chamber, shearing stone and bone alike. It was a 155 long tom shell, fired from beyond Naha Bay. It had crossed valleys, ridges, and enemy lines to strike a single point, because a single U.S. Navy spotter plane had marked a flash of a reflection in a rooftop slit the night before. The data was fed back through relay. The relay fed it to Battery C of the 198th Field Artillery. The elevation was punched in. The shot was fired. The Castle Command Center ceased to exist 5 minutes later. In Manchuria, Japanese observers reviewing battlefield data from Luzon issued a classified circular to High Command in Mukden. It stated, "Enemy field artillery now exhibits a battlefield influence previously reserved for tactical bombing. Counter-mobility, command suppression, and forward logistics now routinely dismantled by guns at ranges exceeding operational doctrine. Recommendation: reinforce all critical nodes with underground cover no less than 15 meters." But it was too late. In the Philippines, nothing remained above ground. American infantry followed the shelling with impunity. By the time they reached each new position, the resistance was gone, not destroyed in firefights, not broken in ambushes, gone. And the infantry knew it. They stopped joking about the gerund or the flamethrower. They talked about the long tom. "Those 155s cleared us a highway," said Sergeant Roy Daniels, stepping over the smoldering shell of a Type 95 tank. "More like a parking lot," his corporal replied. "Not even potholes left." They walked through zones where no bullet had been fired. The enemy had simply been erased. On May 28th, a surviving Japanese field company attempted to regroup along a remote ridge near Taeyug, far outside known American supply lines. They believed they were safe. There had been no overflights, no patrol sightings, no signs of pressure. Then the jungle around them erupted. Long tom shells landed in staggered brackets, one on either side of their concealed gear depot, one on a latrine tent, and two directly into the command dugout. 3 volleys, all targets eliminated. The American spotter had been a Filipino scout with a mirror and a field radio, transmitting from a ruined church steeple 7 miles away. By June, Japanese soldiers began to assign names to the long tom. Yamano Oni, the mountain demon. Shoki no Kei's, the shock wind. Ongaku Naki Shikaku, death without sound. The myth spread faster than facts. Soldiers whispered of shells that came at night, shells that bent around hills, shells that struck men just for lighting a cigarette. Some of these stories weren't far off. In central Luzon, a group of Japanese engineers attempted to mask a fuel depot by planting rows of fake palm trees and parking rusted-out trucks nearby as decoys. The deception worked for 1 day. On the second day, an American forward observer noticed that shadows cast by the trees did not shift correctly during sunrise. That afternoon, long tom shells cratered the depot to its foundations. None of the engineers survived. On Okinawa, the 24th Division tried a different tactic, hiding entirely underground. For 2 weeks, they remained in darkness, shifting through tunnels, never surfacing, never firing. And yet, on June 6th, their exit points were struck within the span of 15 minutes, one after the other. The Americans had triangulated carbon dioxide buildup vents using aerial thermal imaging and matched them against topographic maps. Then they fired. The first shell struck a vent beside the command entrance. The second collapsed the ceiling. The third detonated inside a kitchen shaft. The Japanese who weren't crushed were cooked alive. By now, survivors didn't even blame American infantry. They didn't curse pilots, they cursed the guns. Every letter sent home, or what fragments of them were later recovered, said the same thing. They strike from nowhere. The ground shakes before the air does. There is no reply. One sergeant, shortly before dying of shock after a shell landed 20 feet from his foxhole, whispered, "The shells arrive before your thoughts catch up." The American artillery crews themselves were changing. They no longer saw their shells as support. They called them decisions. You don't argue with a 155. You don't negotiate. You don't even retaliate. You just go silent. And for every mile they advanced, another battery was brought forward, sometimes by bulldozer, sometimes by plane, always forward. The jungle didn't matter. The hills didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that the barrel had line of sight to the sky, because gravity would handle the rest. In Tokyo, General Anami reviewed the Luzon campaign's final report. Out of 350,000 Japanese personnel deployed to the island, over 260,000 were now confirmed dead or missing. But what shocked him wasn't the total. It was how few of those casualties had died in close contact. The rifle had been defeated, the bayonet made irrelevant, the sword ceremonial. And much of the damage traced back to fewer than 100 artillery pieces. Specifically, the M155 Mlong Tom and its attached fire doctrine. Anami circled one line of the report in red ink. Enemy no longer needs to see us to destroy us. In the final weeks of the war, the guns didn't slow down. If anything, they became faster. Faster to fire. Faster to relocate. Faster to decide where death would fall next. By July 1945, the 155 Mlong Tom had become the backbone of American pressure across the Pacific. While aircraft lit up the skies over the Japanese home islands and submarines strangled shipping, the Long Tom fired daily from bases in the Philippines, Saipan, Guam, and even newly claimed positions near Okinawa. It wasn't just a field gun anymore, it was a message. A message to every Japanese commander still holding out hope that the empire could negotiate a better peace, or inflict one final, bleeding price for victory. That message was written in 95-pound shells and delivered from 14 miles away. In one corner of Kyushu, Japanese engineers studied captured reports and tried to map where American artillery might reach once an invasion began. The map turned black. They didn't just lose beaches, they lost valleys, ridges, roadways, ammo caches, communication hubs. Before the first American boot could even touch Japanese soil, the artillery had already reached inland. They called it Uri, shaking of the land, not from earthquakes, from artillery that struck before it could be heard. At a mountain shrine near Kumamoto, a monk who had served in the China campaigns before leaving the army looked up at the clouds as distant thunder rolled across the countryside. There were no storms in the forecast, no aircraft overhead. He closed his eyes. The sound reminded him of Luzon, of Bataan, of the ridgelines. He whispered a prayer, not for victory but for silence. Because he knew that as long as that sound carried through the clouds, Japan still lived beneath the reach of a weapon that didn't care what flag you flew. In Okinawa, American spotters no longer had to climb ridges. They used radios and triangulation. In some cases, they never left the trucks. The Garand still fired, the mortars still dropped, the flamethrowers still roared, but the Long Tom was what made every hilltop possible. It silenced machine gun nests before a squad ever approached. It cratered cave mouths from beyond the horizon. It knocked out tanks before they knew they were seen. And it made the Japanese question every doctrine they had ever held. In Tokyo, as Emperor Hirohito prepared to broadcast surrender on August 15th, A small team of military scholars compiled their final report for the War Archive. It cataloged the technological failures of the Empire. The report listed the B-29, the Essex-class carrier, the proximity fuse, the M4 Sherman. But in the margin, someone had added by hand. Never solved 155 problem, could not locate, could not outrange, could not suppress. There was nothing more to add. In the days after surrender, American artillery units began to roll their guns into long-term storage. Crews cleaned them, disassembled breech blocks, logged their shots. The long toms were quiet now. But every man who had fired one remembered the sound. The recoil. The second long delay. The way the jungle would lift before the thunder hit. It wasn't a sound you ever forgot. In a small camp hospital outside Manila, a Japanese lieutenant recovering from shrapnel wounds asked his American guard, "What kind of aircraft dropped those shells?" The American, a former gunnery sergeant, laughed once and shook his head. "Didn't come from the sky," he said. "Came from 14 miles behind me." The lieutenant stared. He didn't understand. But that was the point. The M1155 Long Tom had never been a secret. Its specifications were public, its blueprints dry, mathematical, measured. But what Japan had never known, not truly, was how far that reach went when combined with American fire control, logistics, and forward coordination. They had assumed artillery softened a battlefield. They never imagined it could erase it. In the post-war years, military historians tried to assign value to different weapons. Some pointed to the B-29, others to the M1 Garand, others to naval power. But among the men who walked through shell-pocked valleys and cratered jungles, the answer was always the same. The Long Tom made the enemy invisible. It made retreat meaningless. It made range a myth. And it made resistance hopeless. The war was over. The guns were quiet. But every Japanese officer who had survived Luzon carried the same sound into the silence. Not the scream of a kamikaze. Not the rumble of tanks. Not the roar of naval bombardment. Just a deep, mechanical thunder that started far away and ended inside your bones. A single, unbroken voice that said, "We can reach you." And always, always, it came from beyond the horizon.